cursor blinked mockingly on Emma's phone screen as her thumb hovered over the send button. The message was already typed. Hey, something came up. Rain check. It was the perfect escape, vague enough to be believable, polite enough to leave the door open for never actually rescheduling. Her heart pounded as she stared at those 9 words that would let her retreat back into the safety of her carefully constructed solitude. But something made her pause, some inexplicable whisper in her mind that begged her to reconsider, to take one more chance on something that terrified her more than anything else in the world. Genuine human connection. Emma had been alone for 3 years, not because she couldn't find someone, but because she had built walls so high that even she sometimes forgot what existed beyond them. Her last relationship had ended in devastation, the kind that leaves scars you can't see but feel every single day. Marcus had promised her forever, had looked into her eyes and painted pictures of their future together, only to disappear one random Tuesday, with nothing but a note on the kitchen counter and half the furniture missing. The betrayal hadn't just broken her heart, it had shattered her ability to trust, to believe that anyone could actually mean the words they said or keep the promises they made. Visir, if you believe in second chances, in the power of taking risks even when you're scared, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us share more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Daniel had walked into her life 6 weeks ago at the most mundane of places. The grocery store of all locations. She had been debating between 2 brands of pasta sauce, genuinely overthinking this trivial decision as if it carried some cosmic significance, when he appeared beside her and casually mentioned that the one in her left hand had a better blend of herbs. They had laughed about the absurdity of having strong opinions about marinara sauce, and somehow that laughter had turned into a conversation that stretched across 3 aisles and ended with him nervously asking for her number. Emma had surprised herself by giving it to him, though she'd immediately regretted it the moment he walked away. Their text conversations over the following weeks had been surprisingly easy, filled with the kind of natural flow that made her forget to guard herself. Daniel was funny without trying too hard, thoughtful without being overbearing, and patient in a way that suggested he understood she was carrying something heavy. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give, and somehow that gentle approach had coaxed her into agreeing to an actual date. But as the day approached, the old fears had crept back in like fog rolling across a harbor, thick and suffocating and impossible to see through. What if he was just another Marcus? What if she opened herself up again only to discover that vulnerability was just another word for volunteering to be hurt? What if she let herself hope, and that hope turned into the crushing disappointment she'd sworn she'd never experience again? These questions had circled in her mind like vultures for days, growing louder and more insistent until this moment, sitting on her couch with that unsent message glowing on her screen, feeling the familiar urge to run before anything could go wrong. But Emma's finger didn't press send. Instead, she closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe, to remember what her therapist had told her about the difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself. She thought about the genuine warmth in Daniel's texts, the way he'd remembered small details she'd mentioned in passing, how he'd sent her a photo of a ridiculous hat he'd seen in a shop window because it reminded him of something she'd said about her grandmother. These weren't the actions of someone planning to devastate her. They were the actions of someone actually paying attention, someone who saw her as a person worth knowing. She deleted the message. Her hands were shaking as she set the phone down and stood up, moving toward her bedroom to get ready. The decision felt monumental, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump, while trusting that somehow, some way, she wouldn't hit the ground. Every step toward that date felt like an act of rebellion against the fear that had controlled her for so long. And though terror still coursed through her veins, there was something else there too. A tiny spark of possibility that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. The restaurant Daniel had chosen was a small Italian place tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of spot that felt intimate without being pretentious. Emma arrived 5 minutes early but sat in her car for 3 of those minutes, giving herself one final chance to flee. She didn't. When she walked through the door, she spotted Daniel immediately, sitting at a corner table, nervously straightening his napkin. The moment he saw her, his entire face transformed into a smile so genuine and relieved that something in Emma's chest unclenched just slightly. The evening unfolded like a dream she'd forgotten she was allowed to have. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughs that came easily and naturally. Daniel told her about his work as a teacher, about the kid in his class who was convinced that dinosaurs still existed in remote jungles, and Emma found herself sharing things she hadn't spoken about in years. Her love of painting that she'd abandoned after the breakup, her dream of someday visiting the lavender fields in Provence, the complicated relationship she had with her father. He listened not just with his ears but with his whole attention, asking questions that showed he genuinely wanted to understand who she was beneath the surface she presented to the world. Hours passed like minutes. The restaurant staff began giving them gentle hints that closing time approached, and Emma realized with shock that she didn't want the night to end. As they walked to their cars, Daniel turned to her with a vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored her own, and said that he'd had the best evening he'd experienced in longer than he could remember. He admitted that he'd been nervous, that dating after his divorce 2 years ago had been challenging, that he'd almost convinced himself that maybe it was easier to stay alone than risk getting hurt again. His honesty cracked something open in Emma, and before she could stop herself, she told him about the message she'd almost sent, about how close she'd come to canceling, about the fear that nearly won. Daniel's response changed everything. He didn't laugh or minimize her feelings or act hurt that she'd almost bailed. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, telling her that he understood completely that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. He thanked her for showing up, for giving him a chance, for being brave enough to take a risk on something uncertain. In that moment, standing under the streetlight with her hand in his, Emma felt something shift inside her. Not a complete healing of all her wounds, but a genuine belief that maybe she could learn to trust again, to hope again, to let someone in without it inevitably leading to destruction. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey through fear and hope, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Their relationship didn't magically fix everything. Emma still had moments of panic, days when the old fears resurfaced and she wanted to retreat. But Daniel stayed patient, and she practiced staying present. And together they built something real on a foundation of honesty and mutual understanding. 6 months later, when Daniel told her he loved her, Emma realized she'd been waiting her entire life to hear those words from someone who actually meant them, someone who saw all of her, including the broken parts, and chose to stay anyway. Before we finish this story, take a moment to comment below. Have you ever almost given up on something that turned out to be the best decision you ever made? Share your story in the comments. Das Sectum, the message Emma almost sent that night, remains saved in her drafts as a reminder. Sometimes she would look at it and marvel at how different her life would be if she'd pressed send, if she'd let fear make that choice for her. She'd learned that the bravest thing we can ever do isn't fearlessly charging forward. It's acknowledging our terror and taking one small step anyway. That night at the restaurant, Emma didn't just show up for a date. She showed up for herself, for the possibility of joy, for the chance to write a different ending to her story than the one fear had planned. And in that single act of courage, she discovered that sometimes the things we almost walk away from are exactly the things we've been searching for all along. Thank God she didn't cancel that text. Thank God she chose hope over fear. Thank God she gave love one more chance to surprise her.